Hi, I'm Old Norse Specialist Jackson Crawford. For more than 5 years, I have, for reasons surpassing anyone's understanding, made more than 600 public videos about topics in Norse language, myth, and related topics. And in the past couple of years, I have been nearly exclusively supported in those efforts by my generous community of Patreon supporters. Again, for reasons surpassing anyone's understanding. Today, I have a topic that's maybe 1 tablespoon of story time with Uncle Jack and maybe 2 tablespoons of the kind of rant that I occasionally go on that perhaps 3 people will listen to in order to disagree with. But let's go with that. Today I want to talk about what I think is an overfixation that a lot of commenters, especially on the internet, have with so-called universals or deeper connections in myths across the world. Now, I'm not going to go into total storytime mode here because I've told the story before, but in the Skaldskaparmál, the second part of Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, Snorri tells a story about how, and I'm going to abbreviate it here, but you can find more detail about this in another video or by looking at the Prose Edda. If you're reading it in English, I'd read the translation by Fawkes. Anyway, the gods kill a Jotun, popularly translated giant. I've started to experiment with translating anti-god, as in my Great Courses class in Norse mythology. But at any rate, a humanoid being of power approximating the gods, but that is against the gods, so Jotun, giant, anti-god, named Thjatsi, who takes the form of an eagle. His daughter, Skathi, wants repayment for this violence on the part of the gods against her family, and so she comes to the gods demanding repayment, and one of the things that they offer her is a husband from among the gods. Of course, the gods being the highest status beings, marrying one is the best you can do in terms of marriage. But they stipulate that she has to choose the god that she will marry by his feet alone. And she looks at all of the gods' feet, right, as they're arrayed behind a curtain or something like that. And she picks the one with the cleanest feet, and it turns out that it's not the beautiful Balder, which is the one that she wanted, because she thought that the most handsome god would have the most handsome feet, I guess. But instead it is Njordur, who spends a lot of his time by the sea, so his feet are clean because he's in the water a lot. So she's disappointed, but she has to marry him anyway. All right, that's a very quick précis of the Norse story. Again, for more detail, see another video or see the Prose Edda itself. Now, another set of stories that I really enjoy is the Nez Perce lore. The Nez Perce are a tribe of the Northern Rockies, and if you want a taste of their storytelling, there's a good book you can dip your toe into with 10 stories collected by Archie Finney. There's also, of course, the amazing historical work I Will Fight No More Forever about the Nez Perce War in the late 1870s. It's a really good book, and also gives you kind of a good historical window into the tribe. Anyway, among the stories collected in that 10 stories book is one about Stellas Jay. Stellas Jays are a bird of the Rocky Mountains that I really like. Many videos on my channel have featured Stellas Jays here and there just because I like them so much, and of course I'm guilty of feeding them. But anyway, according to the story. Stellas Jay, who in Nez Perce is named Kuyes, which is based on his call Kuyes, which does kind of sound like one of their calls, Kuyes. Stellas Jay desires a beautiful woman, and to entice her, he makes fake legs for himself, right? He's a bird, he's really skinny bird legs, but he makes fake handsome muscular legs for himself out of I want to say pine resin, and molds these around his thin little legs to disguise them as big handsome legs. And he goes to her tent and he sticks one of these fake legs through, and she's intrigued by this handsome leg that sticks through her tent, and so she goes outside of the tent and she starts following this being with the handsome legs. Some other men see her following him, and she's kind of embarrassed to be seen pursuing a man, and that so she decides, well, she's got to catch up with him, right? Got to make this worth it, I suppose, is her thinking. And she follows him across a stream, and in the stream, his fake legs come apart and reveal his thin little bird legs. But at any rate, once they've crossed the stream, she becomes his wife anyway, and she lives in disappointment because he thinks she likes the food that he likes as a bird. Okay. I've actually, I think, told the story before in a video about what I call the dream logic of myths. And the dream logic is part of what I think does unite myths around the world, but that's not the main thing that I want to focus on today. Today, what I want to look at is, or point out to you as a preface to this larger rant, is you could point to some pretty striking similarities between the Norse story and the Nez Perce story here, right? We have either humanoid disguised as a bird or vice versa. So Thjazi disguised as an eagle, or Stellas Jay disguising at least his legs as human legs. We have a woman choosing her husband by reference to his legs and no other part of him, right? And yet being bound to marry him based on that choice, based on legs. Now, if you were in the mood, you could probably find even more particular similarities, but even those are pretty striking, right? They're strange details, but the Nez Perce and the Norse are separated by, who knows the exact amount, but something along the lines of 15,000 years of human history, probably more than that. I would wager tens of thousands. So the likelihood that this story, the story of Kuyes and the story of Skadi, Thjazi, and Njordur having any kind of meaningful common origin, I think is just impossible. Culture changes too fast. Stories change too fast. And before I start going down the road of this rant, I'm going to pause, let you hear a little bit from my friends and partners at Grimfrost while I listen to a couple ravens back in the mountains behind me. So culture changes really, really fast. You can find examples of this in your own lifetime, no matter how old you are. Probably the most visible place, and well, there's two really visible places where culture changes in the scale of one person's lifetime today. One is in entertainment and popular culture, right? There is a noticeable difference between 40s music, 50s music, 60s music, 70s music, 80s music, 90s music, and probably the next decades, although for me it kind of freezes at the 90s. And in, hairstyles, right? You can look at photos and say, this was taken in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s based on people's hairstyle. You can also see it outside of popular culture and entertainment in the fixations that high status people or people seeking to be high status have. One of the ways that it seems like kind of a universal human desire to signal status is to signal that you're fixated on the right things. Those change pretty fast and can change the discourse at elite levels pretty fast. There's things you could say on TV in 2012 that would be considered great, but if you said them on TV in 2022, you would become an object of hatred. I'm not going to cite any particular examples because that would just start more fights in the comments than I want, but these things change and can change in pretty unpredictable ways. Stories change too, and stories as they change can travel pretty fast. So my family has a story about my great uncle and earlier Jackson Crawford, who during some engagement in World War II in the European theater, and I don't recall that anyone living today telling the story is ever very specific about what engagement that was, that he was unsatisfied. He was a master sergeant. He was unsatisfied with where the commanding officer had positioned the troops, and he punched this man in the face and redirected the troops to a safer position, and this saved a lot of lives. I don't know how true this is. I heard a lot of stories from him, none that actually specifically resembled this one very much, but I've heard variations of it from a lot of family members, and I've also heard variations of it from a lot of family members of a lot of other men who served in World War II. It's a pretty good story if told by a good storyteller, i.e. someone who's a better storyteller than I am, and people adopt it consciously or unconsciously and spread it around to other people. And what's kind of sad about it is that some legitimate examples of heroism that aren't quite as punchy, as it were, get sublimated under these punchier stories that travel around and maybe less true. And the same exact thing happens with mythical stories, right? They travel, but at the same time, they change really fast. One example that you can look at is in the Indo-European languages. We can see that the names of some gods go back to the ancestor Proto-Indo-European language. In particular, there was a god named something like Djauspatar, or Djauspater, whose name means something like sky, father. And it is his name that becomes Latin Jupiter. The first part becomes, of course, Greek Zeus. There is a Sanskrit Djauspatar, and the first part of the name also becomes the Norse god's name, Tyr. But if you look at Tyr and Zeus and Djauspatar, there's not very much similar between them. And in fact, if you look at Roman religion before it underwent a ton of influence from the prestigious Greek religion, probably Zeus and Jupiter didn't have that much in common originally either. These all go back to some figure who probably had, based on his name, something to do with the sky and was a paternal figure. But the exact details about him have changed so much that people are surprised to hear that Tyr and Zeus, that their names have one common origin. The characters in those respective myths don't seem to have very much in common. There's a lot of people who want me to comment on commonalities between myths, even within the Indo-European languages, which are pretty closely related. And the fact is that there's surprisingly little to comment on there. right? By the time that these languages are attested, they've been separated for thousands of years, and people forget how long that is, right? Between the last people speaking a common ancestor of Greek and Old Norse and our written sources for Old Norse, there is something like twice as much time, or what would that be? Something like 5 times as much time as there is between us and those written sources of Old Norse, right? A lot can change in 1,000 years, let alone something like 4,000 years, 5,000 years. In fact, the fact that there are not easy to discern common Indo-European stories, aside from maybe a broad brushstrokes dragon slaying story and a couple formulae that come up in a lot of the older languages. See How to Kill a Dragon, a great book by Calvert Watkins about that. That's actually about how much I would expect to be preserved, given the huge distances involved, the huge numbers of millennia involved, and the hugely different influences that each culture would find in Europe or India, and every point in between and many points beyond. Now, you do have cases where you can tell that myths do have pretty obvious, more recent ancestral forms that they share. But these also tend to have really obvious geographical proximity to one another. So, Old English and Old Norse, if we look at those languages 1,000 years ago, they look nearly mutually intelligible, something that Simon Roper and I explored in a conversation about a year ago. And unsurprisingly, their cultures are quite similar, and we would expect their mythologies to be pretty similar, although next to nothing about the pre-Christian gods is preserved in Old English. But we do have the Old English story of Beowulf, a hero who comes from Geatland, or modern Swedish Götaland, to Denmark to face a monster who is terrorizing the hall of a Danish king who is part of the Shielding or Skilding dynasty, and he defeats it single-handedly. That exact same thing happens with a hero named Bodvar, who comes from Götaland to assist a Danish king in the Skilding dynasty fight a monster, and he defeats it single-handedly outside of his hall that the monster's been terrorizing. The same thing happens in the Norse Saga of Rolf Kraki, which I've recently published a translation of. But that resemblance between the story in Beowulf and the story of Bodvar in the Saga of Rolf Kraki is not that shocking, and it's still not perfect, right? They don't have the same name. They do both share strong associations with bears, which probably isn't an accident. But it's not the exact same story about the exact same people. A lot has changed even in just the few hundred years that separate the English from the Norse story. In a somewhat more distant vein, the Norse god Thor looks a lot like the Slavic god Perun from what we know about Perun, but there's also a long history of contact on the borders between Germanic-speaking and Slavic-speaking peoples, so that's not too shocking. With languages that are related, you can point out similarities that go beyond the accidental and point to actual patterns that produce predictable results. Right? With languages, you can't just point and say, as the author of a book about the Zuni language purporting to connect it to Japanese, something like 20 years ago, sort of infamously did. You can't just point at, the word for chicken starts with the same thing in these two languages. That really doesn't matter. For any two languages, I can set up a set of coincidental similarities like that. What does matter is what, and I'll use a strained word, scientific linguists do, which is set up correspondence sets where we say that a P in Greek is an F in words of the same meaning in the inherited vocabulary in Germanic languages like English or Norse. That has predictive force, right? And the very fact that it's predictive and systematic tells you that it's more than just a coincidence. And it's so much harder to do that with stories. There is such a thing as scholarly folkloristics, and some work is done with tracking motifs and even some small details of stories as they spread between cultures. One person who worked on that with actually the Beowulf and Bothwell story particularly was Peter Jorgensen at the University of Georgia. But that's different from this, again, very popular on the internet drive to overgeneralize and try to sort of reconstruct this like world mythos, world culture, proto world culture or language. There's just too much time that's passed. A culture, especially a culture without media that survives from previous generations in the form of books or movies or records, is going to forget what things were like 100 years ago and may radically change, just as our own culture has changed in some respects pretty radically in the last 50 years also. When I was little, I would go to restaurants frequented by what I'll call people of a sort of general Western American culture, small cowboy dive bar type places. And men would take their hats off inside those places. My grandfather always did, and would, knock my hat off my head if I forgot to. But now, in the early 2020s, I go to those same places I went with him, and everyone is wearing his hat, young and old. And, I think part of what's changed is that it's more about signaling, like, I'm the kind of guy who wears this kind of hat, and less about the finer intra-group signaling of, and I know the etiquette that's associated with it. You couldn't have predicted that 25 years ago, but it is a change that has happened in the culture, and 25 years from now, there may be further changes that are well beyond my ability to predict. Not being able to set up systematic predictions makes me extremely skeptical that you can look backwards and systematically predict some ancestor form that connects something like a Nez Perce story to a Norse story, or even really a Norse story to an English story, right? What is the ancestor, quote unquote, of the Beowulf Bothwell story? Most likely certain details never were included in the Norse version or the English version. A really great example of this actually is probably the Balder story, which I've talked about at length in another video. Probably combines some elements of an older Germanic language story and an older Finnish story. But I doubt that the Finnish story that contributed to creating the Balder story was exactly like the Finnish story that you find in the Kalevala. Things change fast, things change often, and people change their minds about things to signal or just out of plain forgetfulness or just out of plain boredom. And the drive to find the drive to find meaning in the similarities of software in human beings who, share the same hardware. So of course the software is going to come in a certain predictable set of options. Just strikes me as not being interesting, right? I could set up stories about birds and a big table from all around the world and probably find some striking similarities, but what would I learn by doing it, right? I would make kind of a catalog, kind of a phone book. I wouldn't have a way of predicting the bird stories in the next, ancient or modern human culture that I might come in contact with. I just think that science or scholarship in general to move forward needs to be either predictive, if it's going to be systematic and theoretical, or it needs to be, and maybe I should say or needs to be humble about the fact that you can learn things and notice similarities between them, just like you can notice that lots of birds around the world are blue, but that doesn't mean that there is some deep mystical connection between them that makes those stories similar in whatever way, or makes those birds blue. Maybe the stories became similar because people have pretty similar desires the world over, and maybe the birds are blue because of similar environmental pressures or similar coincidences that happen in one place and another. Well, it's a rant, and I regret how much of a rant it is, but hopefully 2 or 3 of the 5 people who might have watched this point will get something out of it. And from beautiful Colorado, let me wish you all the very best.